Hi, my name is Linda Geerligs, and today I'd like to talk to you about the neural mechanisms of event segmentation. So to introduce this concept, I would like to ask you to think about how your day has been so far. So as you're doing this, probably you're thinking about specific events that happened in your day. And this is really a characteristic feature of how we process the continuous stream of information that comes in through our senses. And this has several important advantages. So first of all, it gives us a compact representation of an extended period of activity. And second, the boundaries between those events are key moments at which we store information from the previous event into long-term memory. But it also has advantage for how we process information in this moment. Because an event boundary basically allows us to free up working memory that's associated with the previous event and to reorient ourselves to this current context. So one way that we can study event segmentation in the lab is by looking at narratives. And narratives are basically condensed representations of real-world-like events and interactions, which lend them very high ecological validity. Also because we are very used to dealing with narratives in our daily lives, like movies or listening to stories. And what we can ask people to do is to indicate when they think one meaningful unit in the narrative began and another one ended. And people are able to do so quite reliably. They're able to indicate very similar moments as transitions between events. So what I'm interested in is what are the neural mechanisms of event segmentation. And this work is basically inspired by this key paper by Chris Baldessano and colleagues in Neuron in 2017. And what they introduced is this idea of neural states. And a neural state is basically a period of time during which the voxel activity pattern is pretty stable before it transitions to a different voxel activity pattern. So here we can see that there are these two moments of transition of different activity patterns. So let's look at that in some real data. So here we see data from the medial prefrontal cortex. And what you can see here is that the activity pattern here, this is a correlation matrix, time by time correlation matrix of data averaged across participants. And what we see here is that there's this period during which the voxel activity pattern is very similar, so the correlation remains very high, and then suddenly there's a switch to a different activity pattern. And again, that's stable for a while until there's a switch. So we can use data-driven algorithms to identify these boundaries between neural states. And what Baldessano and colleagues showed is that these neural states, they have interesting overlap with event boundaries. So the time points where we identify boundaries between neural states overlap with boundaries between events. And also that there seems to be this hierarchy. So there are more neural states in low-level areas, whereas multimodal regions show fewer neural states that are longer lasting. So in their paper, they propose this hypothesis, which is that there should be this nested temporal hierarchy of neural states that underlies our ability to segment experience into events. So the key idea here is that each brain region segments information at its own preferred time scale. So for example, here low-level auditory might segment at the level of words, a higher level region might segment at the level of sentences, and this multimodal region might segment at the level of paragraphs. And there's this nested quality, which means that some of these boundaries that are already detected at low levels also propagate across the cortical hierarchy, whereas others only occur in low-level areas. And particularly in these multimodal areas, there should be a very good correspondence between the subjective events that are experienced and the neural states that we can identify in these brain regions. So to test this theory, we developed a number of very specific hypotheses. So first of all, what we expected was to see this temporal hierarchy of state duration. So short time scale in low-level auditory areas or low-level sensory regions, and long time scale in multimodal areas. We also expect to see this overlap between neural state and event boundaries, and particularly strongly for these multimodal areas where there is this clear correspondence, a better correspondence between the time scale of neural states and subjective events. Third, we expect that neural state boundaries are shared between different brain regions. And fourth, we expect that those neural state boundaries that are shared across regions, so those that are propagated upward in the cortical hierarchy, are also more likely to be subjectively experienced as events. So we tested this with data from the Cambridge Center for Aging and Neuroscience. We had 256 participants who all watched this short movie by Alfred Hitchcock called Bang, You're Dead. And we used our greedy state boundary search algorithm that we developed to detect these neural state boundaries. And we did this in small searchlights that we moved across the entire cortex. And here are the results. So here you see, in this picture, you see the temporal hierarchy of the duration of neural states in the cortex. And what you can see is that there are very short-lasting states here in visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, and somatosensory, primary somatosensory cortex. Whereas there are very long-lasting neural states here in lateral prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, and the anterior insula. And this pattern is very reliable because it occurs, we see a very similar pattern here in this independent group of participants. And we can see these differences in state durations even by just looking at the data by eye. So here we have data again averaged across groups in visual cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. And we see this fast changing pattern here. We see this longer lasting states here. So a second hypothesis we wanted to test is that neural state boundaries should co-occur with subjective event boundaries. So to test this, we got data from Aya Benyakov, where a different group of participants had actually rated whether particular moments were boundaries between distinct events. And we looked at where those event boundaries were and their overlap with the neural state boundaries that we identified with our data-driven algorithm. And what we found is that there was actually significant overlap between the two across nearly the entire cortex. But most strongly here in this lateral prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, and anterior insula areas. Third, we expect that neural state boundaries co-occur across brain regions. So we looked at the overlap for each pair of searchlights that we investigated. And what we found is that there was a significant overlap, so everything that's not white is significant here, between most pairs of searchlights. So this is a searchlight by searchlight matrix showing you the amount of overlap. And we also found that there were these groups of brain regions that had particularly strong overlap with each other. And these groups actually resemble the networks that we tend to identify in resting state connectivity research. So for example, we see a visual network, a dorsal attention network, a default mode network, and frontoparietal networks. And finally, we investigated whether neural state boundaries that are shared across regions are also more likely to co-occur with the event boundaries. And so here we looked at if a boundary was shared between two different networks, was it more likely to co-occur with a subjective event boundary? And this was indeed the case, particularly for this anterior default mode network here, but also for this auditory network here. So boundaries that were shared between all these different networks, between the anterior default mode and other networks, or between the auditory and other networks, were more likely to also be perceived as an event boundary by the participants. So to conclude, we can say that event segmentation is indeed supported by a partially nested cortical hierarchy of neural states. We found strong support for this hypothesis. We found that there's this temporal hierarchy of neural state segmentation in the brain. We found that there's this clear overlap between subjective event boundaries and neural state boundaries, particularly in higher level areas. We found that neural state boundaries are shared between brain regions, and that shared boundaries are more likely to also co-occur with event boundaries. So I want to thank you for watching this, thank you for your attention, and I want to acknowledge my PhD students, Dora and Jamari here, and the collaborators on this project.